It's December 5th, 1872. The Atlantic is calm, the sun's out, and the brigantine Dei Gratia is cruising toward Gibraltar, like any other day. Nothing unusual until the crew spots another ship drifting in the distance. At first it looks like no big deal, but as they get closer, something feels off. There are no voices, no movement, and not a single soul at the wheel, just sails flapping in the wind. Captain Morehouse sends a team aboard, and what they find explains why this story is still told 150 years later. The ship was the Mary Celeste, and it was completely deserted, not plundered. You see, the cargo was intact, food still on the table, and the captain's log was neatly written. No signs of a fight or blood. It was like the entire crew had just vanished into thin air. So what happened to the crew? Let's find out. The ship was first launched in 1861 in Nova Scotia under the name Amazon. From the very beginning, it seemed to carry bad luck. The very first captain, Robert McClellan, fell gravely ill just a few days into the ship's very first voyage. He had to be taken ashore in a small rowboat, where he soon died, his body carried back in the same little vessel that brought him to land. The first captain of the Amazon never even completed a single voyage. By 1867, it was left battered on the rocks of Cape Breton, considered too costly to repair. That should have been the end of its story. But in the 19th century, especially around the North Atlantic, ships weren't easily thrown away. Damaged vessels were often patched, rebuilt, and sent back out to sea, often under new owners and new names. That's where Richard Haynes comes into the picture. American businessman Richard Haynes bought the wreck, rebuilt her keel and bottom, replaced the rigging, and renamed it to Mary Celeste. Even after all that work, he lost it to creditors and was eventually sold again, ending up in the hands of a New York shipping syndicate. By 1872, it was in the command of Captain Benjamin Briggs, a well-respected sailor who had spent nearly 2 decades at sea. On that trip, the Mary Celeste was hauling 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol. Not exactly exciting cargo, and definitely not the kind you drink unless you want to go blind. The stuff was volatile, packed in wooden barrels, and sitting below deck like a quiet little time bomb. Keep that in the back of your mind, because it's going to matter later. At the helm was Captain Benjamin Briggs. From what we know, he wasn't the type to take risks. He was 37, experienced, respected, and, maybe most important, a man of faith who was incredibly devoted to his family. Devoted enough that he actually brought them with him, his wife Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia. If anything, people later said Briggs leaned on the cautious side. The crew consisted of 7 men, handpicked by Briggs himself, sailors with clean records. Nothing about them suggested trouble. November 7th, 1872, the Mary Celeste leaves New York Harbour, headed for Genoa. A devoted captain, his family, a trusted crew, and cargo locked down tight. Nothing about this voyage seemed unusual, but less than a month later on December 5th, another ship, the Dei Gratia, spots it drifting about 400 miles east of the Azores. Same ship and cargo, but no crew in sight. So what was the condition of the ship when it was found? The sails were partly up, a few damaged, but nothing that should have stopped the ship. The rigging looked a bit messy, but the hull was solid. There was some water below deck, about 3.5 feet. But that was normal for ships of the time. It wasn't sinking, the cargo was fine too. Out of 1,701 barrels, only 9 were empty. The crew's stuff was all still there, clothes, boots, pipes, even valuables. Food and water for 3 months, neatly packed away. The logbook was sitting right where it should be, with regular entries up until November 25th, just 10 days before the ship was found. The only thing missing was the lifeboat, which means the crew, or at least some of them, got off the ship on their own. A lifeboat gone isn't the same as a shipwreck. It means they walked away. The mystery is what pushed them to do it. The main question here is, why would a captain and his crew just walk off a ship that was fine? For 150 years, people have been coming up with theories. The trouble is, each one makes sense until it suddenly doesn't. The first big theory is the alcohol vapor one. And honestly, it kind of makes sense. The Mary Celeste was packed with 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol on its way to Genoa. Not drinking stuff, the kind that could actually make you go blind. When they found the ship, 9 of those barrels were empty. Those 9 barrels weren't even made from the same kind of wood. They were red oak, which soaks and leaks way easier than white oak. Basically, the worst choice for holding something that is flammable. Now imagine you're Captain Briggs, or maybe one of the crew. You crack open the hatch, and suddenly that sharp, almost choking smell of alcohol vapour hits you. You're standing on a wooden ship, lit by open flames with fumes rising all around. It's like sitting inside a giant tinderbox, just waiting for a spark. So fearing an explosion, he orders everyone into the small lifeboat, while they ventilate the ship. It's a temporary evacuation, not a permanent one. They tie the lifeboat to the Mary Celeste with a rope, planning to return once it's safe. Fits nicely, doesn't it? It explains why the lifeboat was missing, why the cargo was mostly intact, and why there was no sign of panic. They left in an orderly fashion. Well, that's the theory. But the problem starts showing up. If Briggs was being cautious, why not take his navigational instruments? Why not at least bring the ship's chronometer? A chronometer is basically a super accurate watch. Those tools were left on board. Without them, a lifeboat in the Atlantic was basically blind. And if the fumes were the problem, why not just open the hatches and wait? Ships carried alcohol all the time, and captains knew how to ventilate. Even if they panicked, why didn't they come back? The sea was calm enough that the Dei Gratia found the ship floating steady days later. So something doesn't add up, which brings us to the second theory. When the crew from the Dei Gratia came aboard, they noticed the pumps had been taken apart. That was a big deal, since the pumps were what kept water from piling up in the hold, and sure enough, there were about 3.5 feet of water sloshing around down there. Not great, but not a disaster either. Still, if you were sailing through bad weather, it might have looked a lot scarier than it really was. The pumps clogged, perhaps with debris from recent repairs. Briggs sent the crew below to check the water. They pulled out the sounding rod, the instrument used to measure how much water lay in the hold. In rough seas, the readings gave a false impression. The crew may have believed the ship was flooding quickly. A cautious captain, with his wife and child on board, decided to abandon the Mary Celeste before it slipped beneath the waves. The evidence seemed to support this. The pump stood in pieces. The sounding rod lay on deck. The logbook recorded heavy weather in late November. It was easy to imagine Briggs staring at the storm clouds, then at his family, and choosing the lifeboat over the uncertainty of the sea. Yet Briggs had not been a careless sailor. He carried decades of experience. Would he have misread the danger so completely? When the Dei Gratia crew later brought the Mary Celeste into Gibraltar, the vessel proved seaworthy. The ship wasn't actually going down. Sure, the theory lined up with the evidence, but it made Briggs look overly jumpy. And for a man known as steady and careful, that just doesn't quite sit right. Now let's talk about the ocean itself, because the sea doesn't need help from leaking barrels or broken pumps to cause chaos. One possibility is that Mary Celeste ran into a violent weather event. Waterspouts, rogue waves, and sudden squalls are quite common at sea. A waterspout is basically a tornado on water, and it could whip across a deck in seconds, tearing sails, smashing rigging, and terrifying even the toughest sailors. Rogue waves, on the other hand, are freakishly large walls of water. They can appear out of nowhere. It matches some details, damaged sails, and log entries about rough seas. And it has precedent. There are modern cases where ships survive storms, but crews abandoned them out of fear and never made it back. From there, it's not a big leap to the next idea, one that boils down to simple human error. Sometimes the simplest explanation is human error. This theory says Briggs thought he was closer to land than he really was. The clouds could have made navigation tricky, so Briggs thought that the Azores were right there, just a short trip away. So he loaded everyone into the yawl, tied it to the Mary Celeste, and planned to finish the journey the safe way. But then the rope snapped, and just like that, the little boat drifted off into the Atlantic, gone for good. It checks a lot of boxes, right? Lifeboat's missing, no signs of a fight, no blood. Simple mistake. End of story. Except, Briggs wasn't the kind of guy to gamble like that. This was a careful, cautious captain, with his wife and toddler on board. Would he really risk their lives in a lifeboat when Mary Celeste still had food, water, and a roof over their heads? That doesn't sound like him at all. And if it doesn't sound like him, then maybe the sea isn't the villain here. Maybe it was people. What if someone made sure Mary Celeste ended up empty, without leaving a single mark behind? Mutiny is one of those theories that always pops up, mostly because it is such a familiar story at sea. The crew gets tired of the captain, tempers flare, and they rise up and take control of the ship. But that just does not fit here. When the men from the Dei Gratia went aboard, they did not see chaos. Everything was still in its place. Even valuables like watches, jewellery, and instruments were sitting untouched. And think about it. If the crew really had turned on Captain Briggs and his family, why would they just leave the Mary Celeste drifting out in the ocean? A mutiny usually ends with the crew sailing the ship somewhere and trying to claim it. Instead, it was left wandering empty, like a ghost. Another theory people bring up is pirates. The mid-Atlantic was not completely safe in the 19th century. There were still stories of raiders, especially closer to the Mediterranean. So maybe a pirate crew climbed aboard, took what they wanted, and either killed or carried off everyone. But here is the snag. The Mary Celeste was loaded with industrial alcohol, a cargo worth a lot of money, and nothing was touched. All 1,701 barrels were still sitting there. Even cash, charts, and personal belongings were left behind. Pirates do not just walk away from valuables. That is their whole reason for being there in the first place. Which is why another explanation, fraud, started to gain serious traction at the time. When the Mary Celeste was brought into Gibraltar by the Dei Gratia crew, a salvage hearing was held. Maritime law allowed those who rescued a drifting vessel to claim a portion of its value. But before awarding that, the court had to be sure no fraud had taken place. The judge in Gibraltar, Frederick Solly Flood, was immediately suspicious. He couldn't understand why a crew would abandon a ship in good condition unless something dishonest was happening. Maybe the crew of the Dei Gratia had staged the whole thing. Perhaps Briggs himself was in on a scam, abandon the ship, claim insurance, and split the profits. The suspicion wasn't baseless. In that era, cases of staged abandonment did happen. Ships were expensive, insurance payouts could be high, and not every owner or captain was above cheating the system. Records from New England and Nova Scotia show that salvage disputes were common. Courts had to weigh motive against risk. But here's where the fraud theory fails. For one, Captain Briggs had a strong reputation for honesty. He wasn't desperate for money, nor was Mary Celeste in such poor condition that it needed to be written off. Abandoning the ship with his wife and young child on board makes no sense. No scheme could justify risking their lives. And as for the Dei Gratia, the Gibraltar court dragged its captain, David Morehouse, through suspicion after suspicion. If he and his crew had murdered the others to claim salvage, surely some evidence would remain, but none was ever found. The hearing ended with an award to the Dei Gratia, though only a fraction of what they claimed. The judge made it clear he still harboured doubts, but he had no proof. So when the usual suspects didn't stick, people started pointing the finger at something wilder: the ocean itself. Back in the 1800s, the ocean was still this wild, mysterious place. Sailors came home with stories about sea serpents longer than ships, and creatures with tentacles thick as tree trunks. So when a perfectly good vessel turned up with no one on board, of course, people started whispering about monsters. The giant squid, for example, wasn't just a myth. In the mid-1800s, huge carcasses actually washed up in places like Newfoundland and the Azores, right along the Mary Celeste's route. One of them stretched over 20 feet long. Newspapers printed drawings, and the public ate it up. So yeah, people really did wonder if a giant squid might have dragged the crew off into the deep. Creepy as that sounds, the problem is biology. Squid don't scoop up entire crews and leave ships perfectly intact. The Mary Celeste had no sucker marks, no shredded sails, nothing you'd expect from a monster attack. The whole sea creature angle lived more in legend than in fact. Then came the ghost ship stories. The image of a ship found empty, with meals left uneaten and cabins undisturbed, was too good for Victorian newspapers to resist. They leaned into the haunting angle hard, and readers loved it. Arthur Conan Doyle, before he ever dreamed up Sherlock Holmes, made it even bigger. In 1884, he published a short story inspired by the mystery, but he called the ship the Mary Celeste. His version was packed with sinister details, and people at the time actually took it as fact. From then on, the real ship wasn't just mysterious, it was cursed, maybe even supernatural. The truth is, the Mary Celeste got caught in a blur between fact and fiction. Paranormal theories weren't born from evidence, but from people's appetite for spooky tales. But here's the strangest part. More than a century and a half later, we're still trying to solve it. Scientists, historians, and even TV shows keep testing theories, but none of them lock into place, which is why many experts quietly go with the most boring answer, the combination theory. Not one single disaster, but a bunch of small problems stacking up. Leaky barrels are giving off fumes, pumps that were clogged and taken apart, bad weather. Captain Briggs, stressed with his wife and little girl on board, decides it's safer to get everyone into the lifeboat for a while. Maybe he figured they could just ride it out nearby until things looked better. But something goes wrong. A rope snaps, a gust of wind pushes them apart, and suddenly, the Mary Celeste is drifting one way, while the lifeboat drifts the other. It explains a lot. Not one theory on its own makes perfect sense, but bits and pieces from each of them kind of line up. The problem is it's all circumstantial. There's no way to test it now. All we can really do is line up the clues and imagine what might have gone through their heads in that moment of fear. Maybe the lifeboat splintered in heavy seas. Maybe it drifted for days before vanishing into the Atlantic. Either way, nothing was ever found. And in that part of the ocean, with strong shifting currents, it's no surprise modern researchers eventually turned to current modelling to see where a missing boat might have ended up. Hydrographic studies around the Azores have been used to backtrack where the ship was found and where the yawl could have gone. Modern drift models, the kind that scientists use today to track oil spills or even airplane debris, like in the case of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, have been applied to the Mary Celeste question. The results suggest that if the crew really did abandon ship near the Azores, the yawl may have drifted into the open Atlantic, carried away in loops and gyres that would scatter it so widely it would never reach land intact. Another modern angle involved the ship's pumps, which were found disassembled when the vessel was discovered. At the time, investigators thought this was odd, but nobody knew how much it mattered. Later, maritime engineers reconstructed similar pumps and compared them to logs of weather the Mary Celeste had faced before being abandoned. The pumps were indeed prone to clogging, especially with seawater mixed with debris or sawdust from the ship's repairs. This made it plausible that Briggs might have believed the pumps had failed and that the ship was silently flooding from below. Modern hydrographic charts, which map water depths and currents with far more accuracy than Briggs ever had, show that his position could easily have been misjudged in the haze of storms. If he thought land was close, then lowering the yawl, while fearing the ship was sinking, might have felt like the safest move. One of the most striking modern experiments involved testing what would happen if a lifeboat were tied to a drifting ship. Maritime historians simulated the tow by lashing a yawl behind a larger vessel under sail. In rough seas, even a thick rope could snap in minutes. Once separated, the smaller boat would quickly fall behind and vanish. A handful of other modern hints keep the mystery alive. For example, chemical tests on timbers suggested no residue of fire, which rules out onboard explosions but doesn't rule out vapor flash scares. Analysis of log entries and known storm systems confirms the Mary Celeste had been through heavy weather, meaning stress and fatigue could have influenced every decision. So where does that leave us? Modern research points us back to the same handful of natural causes: alcohol fumes, faulty pumps, bad weather, and human error. Each one works in parts, but none of them explains it all. Put them together, and maybe you get the answer. But without a lifeboat, without bodies, without a final log entry, we're still left staring at a ghost ship that refuses to give up its secret. And maybe that's the real reason Mary Celeste lives on. Not because we solved her, but because we never could.